Hello class, this is your lecture on leaves. Let's get started. Your outline is as follows. We'll do a brief overview of the leaf organ, then we'll talk about different leaf arrangement and types. We'll look at the anatomy of leaves, then we'll look at some specialized leaves. Finally, we'll look at why leaves change color in the autumn and then eventually fall off in the winter for some types of species. First, a look at leaf structure. All leaves originate as primordia in the buds. Remember, inside of those buds that are found on plants, such as axillary buds or terminal buds, we will find lots of cells dividing. At maturity, most leaves have a stalk, which is referred to as a petiole, and a flattened blade, which is called the lamina, as well as a network of veins, which is the vascular bundles as they run through the blade. Recall some general leaf terminology as well. For example, we can designate a simple leaf versus a compound leaf, and it's all about the position of that axillary bud. If there's one petiole with a blade and an axillary bud, then we know we have a simple leaf. If we have a blade that is subdivided into leaflets, but again, just one single axillary bud where the main petiole attaches to the stem, then we have a compound leaf. Compound leaves can be further classified according to the arrangement of the leaflets. Pinnately compound leaves have leaflets in pairs along the central axis that is called the rachis. The rachis is therefore the main axis to which the leaflets are attached. On the other hand, palmately compound leaves have all of the leaflets attached at one central point, usually at the end of the petiole. Now, pinnately compound leaves may actually be further subdivided and then be referred to as bipinnately compound. In fact, it even goes further than that. There are some species that are tripinnately compound as well. The primary functions of leaves are to do photosynthesis because, as you can imagine, most leaves are green because they contain the pigment chlorophyll. Now, the structure of these leaves are important in that it really allows these plants to do photosynthesis efficiently. For example, the lower surfaces of the leaves are dotted with stomata, and these stomata allow for carbon dioxide to enter and oxygen and water gas to diffuse out. We're going to learn later on in this lecture, however, there are some exceptions to this in that sometimes stomata are found on additional leaf surfaces. It's actually guard cells that control the opening and closing of the stomatal apparatus. Another process that occurs at the leaves is transpiration. This occurs when water evaporates from the surface of a leaf out into the atmosphere. And lastly, we have guttation. This is the process by which root pressure forces water out of special openings called hydothodes. Review some useful leaf characters that we previously discussed this semester. Now, these arrangements and vein patterns are very basic. Remember that there are many plants that don't follow these exact general rules, but we like to learn the general rules for the purpose of the exam. Leaf arrangement comes in three different ways: alternate, which is one leaf per node; opposite, which is two leaves per node; and whorled, which is three or more leaves per node. The leaf venation refers to the pattern of those leaf veins, which we now know the veins are the vascular bundles. Pinnate, palmate, and parallel are the three leaf vein patterns. In pinnate, we have one central midrib with side veins branching out. In palmate, we have one central point from which all the other veins come out of. Pinnate and palmate are both most common in the dicot flowering plants. Parallel veins means all of the veins run parallel to each other, and for this pattern, it's most common in the monocot evolutionary group. The word epiphyte means one thing grows on another thing. The root word epi means upon, and in this case, phyte means plant. And there's a very cute little orchid you can see here growing in the tropical forest that actually lives its life by growing directly on leaves. Pretty unique for the plant world. Now let's talk about the anatomy of leaves. The epidermis is a single layer of cells that covers the entire surface of the leaf, both the upper and the lower surface. Now, the upper epidermal cells are typically missing the chloroplasts in most species. The one exception might be if we find some guard cells up there, then we might find chloroplasts in those guard cells. Now, a waxy cuticle is secreted off of both layers of the epidermis, both the upper and the lower, and it serves to prevent sunburn by reflecting ultraviolet light away, as well as prevents water loss. We often find epidermal glands on the surface of the epidermis as well, and these are often found on hairs called glandular trichomes. These often serve the purpose of keeping insects from eating the leaves because the hairs contain chemicals that taste very bad or they are poisonous. Now, the lower epidermis is where we usually find most of the stomata for most plant species. And again, if we're talking about the stomata, they're simply openings that are controlled by guard cells. The guard cells open and close, and then that creates the stoma itself. Notice the word stoma is singular and stomata is plural. It's cell water pressure that regulates the guard cells, which in turn regulate the stomata. Next up, we have the mesophyll and the veins. Most photosynthesis takes place in the mesophyll between the two epidermal layers. We have palisade mesophyll versus spongy mesophyll. The palisade is the uppermost layer that contains most of the leaf's chloroplasts, and the spongy mesophyll is the lower layer with the air spaces. So now we're looking at all of the space inside of the leaf. The veins are the vascular bundles that contain the xylem and the phloem tissues, and we tend to see these scattered throughout the mesophyll in most dicot species. Sometimes the vascular bundles are surrounded by a bundle sheath, which is composed of thick-walled parenchyma cells. Veins may be composed of other parenchyma cells or fibers as well. In this diagram, it shows us the palisade and spongy mesophyll in relation to the vascular tissue and the epidermis. Notice the stomata are on the lower epidermis only, and notice the palisade mesophyll is dense with chloroplasts. In fact, the palisade contains up to 80% of the chloroplasts of the plant. Also notice the spongy mesophyll has a lot of air space between the cells. That is important because that allows for easy movement of gases into and out of the leaf, because most of the stomata are found in proximity to the spongy mesophyll cells. In this figure, it shows us a typical monocot leaf. In this case, it's a grass leaf with bulliform cells. When there's insufficient water, the bulliform cells collapse, causing the blade to roll inward and slow transpiration. Here we can see a typical dicot leaf. We refer to this as a mesophytic plant because it just looks like your average leaf with well-developed spongy and palisade mesophyll. Now, some leaves are more unique. If the mesophytic leaf is the standard, the next two examples are the extreme leaves. So leaves that grow in deserts or other arid regions are referred to as xerophytic leaves, or we refer to the plant as a xerophyte. Many of these leaves have thick, leathery leaves and very few stomata that are always found on the bottom of the leaf, which is to say the lower epidermis. Some of these leaves are succulent, meaning they store water, and others are dense and hairy, because these dense, hairy coverings actually help reflect away a lot of that sunlight. To further protect the stomata, they often store these on the roof of a stomatal crypt, which is found on the underside of the leaf and is packed dense with hairs called trichomes. In addition, we often find several layers of epidermis on the upper epidermis because by having multiple layers with a thick cuticle, it helps prevent water loss. On the other end of the spectrum, we have leaves of aquatic environments. These are plants that are referred to as hydrophytes. The water lily is a classic example. It has a very thin epidermis with little to no cuticle. We don't need to preserve our water because we grow in the water, so there's no reason to try to save water. Because these leaves float on the surface of the pond, we have stomata that are only on the top surface of the leaf, which is to say the upper epidermis, and inside of the leaf we have big air spaces formed by aerenchyma, a special type of parenchyma that provides buoyancy. Depending on the environmental conditions in which a leaf grows, we can see a shade versus a sun leaf. Shade leaves have very poorly developed mesophyll. Because they receive less total light, they tend to be thinner, larger, and have fewer hairs. If you were walking through a garden and you came across a plant with sharp, pointy things on it, you might refer to it as a thorn, or maybe it's a spine, or maybe it's a prickle. Well, in botany, all three of these are different from each other. It's all about its position on the plant. First up is a spine, which is a modified leaf. These are designed to reduce water loss and protect the plant from getting eaten. For example, a cactus produces spines. Next up is a thorn. A thorn is actually a modified stem, not a leaf. It's all about the position. A thorn arises from the axils of the leaves in woody plants. Therefore, these thorns arise from where the axillary bud was present. Lastly, some plants simply have prickles. It's neither spine nor thorn. These are just outgrowths of the epidermis or outgrowths of the cortex. For example, the sharp things on rose bushes are just classified as prickles. Another specialized leaf is a tendril. And recall from our previous lecture, there can also be a stem tendril as well. It's all about the position of where we find it. For leaf tendrils, they tend to be modified leaflets on a compound leaf. It's very common in members of the pea family, which is called the Fabaceae. Storage leaves are common. Sometimes plants store water in their leaves and are referred to as succulent. Other times they store carbohydrates such as sugars in their leaves. Examples include onions and some lilies. Flower pot leaves are very unique. These are not tremendously common, but they are very cool. They're leaves that develop into an urn-like pouch that becomes a home for ant colonies. The ants live in these little pouches, and then they protect the plant from anything that tries to eat it. Window leaves are also unique. These are found in succulent desert plants of Africa and other extremely dry places. Because it's so extremely hot and dry, the leaves are mostly buried underground most of their life. But if you're buried underground, you can't do photosynthesis. So it has a little window on the tip that allows the light to reflect down into the leaf where photosynthesis may occur. Another type of specialized leaf is a reproductive leaf, and that's where special regions develop along the leaf margins that produce little clones of the parent plant. Examples include the walking fern and the mother plant. Another type of specialized leaf is a floral leaf, also referred to as a bract. These are found at the bases of flowers or flower stalks. So the bract itself is not part of the flower. It might look like a flower petal, but it's not. It's a modified leaf. Examples include poinsettia, that flower that you might see around the holidays, and clary sage. Conifers such as pine trees also produce leaves, and in pines, those leaves are usually in the form of a pine needle. And inside of those pine needles, we find lots of specialized parts, including resin canals, and very unique is an endodermis. An endodermis is usually only found in roots, but in the pine leaf, we find it wrapped around the vascular tissue to help regulate water loss. Some plants grow in places that have very little nitrogen. For example, a swamp or a bog, a very wet system, often has a lot of nutrients leached out of the soil. So to adapt, these plants trap insects. They eat insects to supplement their nutrition. Things like pitcher plants and sundews are two examples. Two more examples of insect trapping leaves includes Venus flytraps, which are active traps that close down on the insect, and a bladderwort, which is also an active trap. These are actually special leaves that are found underwater, and they trap little tiny swimming creatures that are in the pond that this plant lives in. Many places in the world have 4 seasons, and when the fall rolls along, many trees have a beautiful display of colors, and then they drop their leaves. Well, those colors are from pigments in those leaves. Now, most of the year, leaves are green because they're doing lots of photosynthesis. They're dense with different types of chlorophyll molecules. However, there's other pigment molecules as well. Things like carotenoids, which are yellow or orange, are also found in those leaves. And when autumn rolls around, the days get shorter and colder, and those chlorophylls break down to reveal the other colors. Now, there might be other pigments in there as well. Chlorophyll and carotenoid are not soluble in water, but other pigments are soluble in water. Things like anthocyanins or beta-cyanins might be stored in the vacuole. Having anthocyanins in the vacuole might actually give camouflage to some plants. Now, to our eyes, of course, red sticks out to most people, much more so than green. But to an insect, it has evolved to look for green leaves, so a red leaf might not be as visible. Some of the pigments in leaves include chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, carotenoids, xanthophylls, and others. Plants contain all of these pigments, but green chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B mask the red and orange carotenoids. The color that a pigment appears means that is the color of the wavelength of light that is being reflected. By utilizing a wide range of pigments, plants are able to make use of nearly all wavelengths of light that are coming off of the sun from the ultraviolet spectrum. Finally, a lot of times leaves drop their leaves, and the word for that is those plants are deciduous. Now, this occurs as a result of changes in the abscission zone near the base of the petiole of each leaf. After the leaves fall off, it often plugs that area up with suberin impregnated cells to protect from infection. All right, well, now we've talked all things leaves. We've learned an overview of the morphology and anatomy of leaves. We've talked about arrangement and type. We've looked at all of the different cells and tissues inside of leaves. We learned a short list of the specialized leaves. We talked about why leaves change color. And finally, why do leaves fall off of trees in the winter sometimes. All right, please email me with any questions. And thank you for listening.